Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squad for boxing news and views from around the internet. The promoter for Dillian Whyte, Eddie Hearn, is making a push to get his man Whyte made the mandatory to the WBC belt. And he may just have a good chance of doing so now that Dominic Breazeale has been installed to fight Deontay Wilder on May 18th. Breazeale was the mandatory for the past 18 months, despite Whyte being the number one ranked contender in the WBC. And now that Breazeale is stepping up, and his fight, which had been ordered with Whyte, was cancelled, there could be some legal recourse for Whyte and Hearn to apply some pressure to the WBC, and this is exactly what they're doing now. So publicly, Hearn has confirmed that they have lodged an appeal, or they've lodged proceedings with the WBC to get Dillian Whyte installed as the WBC mandatory challenger, now that Dominic Breazeale will be off the books. And given that there was that cancelled fight that was ordered between mandatory Breazeale and Dillian Whyte, the number one contender, and that would have been for an interim title. So the argument from Hearn is, well, actually, you should just make him the mandatory now, because he would have had that on the line for that fight, or he would have had the equivalent of that in an interim title. But now he's left with nothing. It was all taken away. And when you look at the situation and step back, I actually think he's got a pretty good chance of actually winning this with the WBC and sort of bending their ear on this one, because he's confirmed lawyers are involved and there will be a meeting or a mediation of sorts while Mauricio Salaiman, WBC president, is in the UK this weekend for a matchroom card. They'll get around the table with lawyers and talk about, what potentially they could do, what will happen with Dillian Whyte and his status within the WBC. Because I would note, he has been the number one rated contender since the end of November 2017. If you don't believe me, go back and check. So that is 18 months now. Well, in another week or so, 18 full months. And Dominic Breazeale has been the mandatory challenger ever since then, because what happened with him was that he was due to face Stiverne. Stiverne was elevated to fight Deontay Wilder because Luis Ortiz failed a drug test. Dominic Breazeale went on to fight Eric Molina, but because he was meant to be in a fight to potentially fight for the mandatory status, the WBC eventually, and this was after some, shadiness, and they weren't very transparent about this publicly for several months. It was about 6 months after the fact that they confirmed, yes, Breazeale was the mandatory. And if you actually look at the last couple of situations and the circumstances leading to the last two WBC mandatories, I think this will favour Dillian Whyte's case, because with Breazeale, he was meant to fight for the mandatory status. It was taken away. And then also you have Stiverne before him. He was meant to fight Alexander Povetkin in Russia, but Povetkin at the last moment failed the drugs test. So Stiverne, no fight, but ultimately installed a couple of months later, one day after Deontay Wilder's February 25th fight against Gerald Washington in 2017, he was installed as the mandatory. But let's not sort of celebrate yet, because what could actually happen, as happened with Stiverne and Dominic Breazeale, as they were made to wait. So Dillian Whyte may actually sort of bend the WBC's ear here. He may end up being successful with his promoter in these sort of legal proceedings, because there's the threat of the legal challenge here. Because if they can't resolve anything around the table, ultimately, Eddie Hearn, Matchroom Boxing, Dillian Whyte could take the WBC to court. And the threat of that and bleeding the WBC over, court proceedings that could last months, if not longer, that could actually, really hurt the WBC financially. And clearly, if lawyers are already involved, Eddie Hearn believes he must have a pretty decent case if it were to go any further. So they're looking to have some sort of resolution now to halt whatever could happen in terms of legal proceedings, but get an outcome that would be favourable to Whyte. And that would be the WBC mandatory status be awarded to him. And you'd imagine if that was to happen, it would be awarded after Dominic Breazeale and Deontay Wilder fight. So that would have to be after May 18th. But even then, in that scenario, Deontay Wilder may not end up fighting Dillian Whyte for the best part of a year or more. And as I alluded to, the Stiverne and Breazeale situations are a cautionary tale. Stiverne, he was made to wait all year with sort of no sort of chance of fighting Deontay Wilder. He was actually paid step-aside money because Wilder said, not interested in fighting you again. And the whole, him being installed as a mandatory, it was criticised because he had really done nothing to deserve it. He'd had one fight in 2 years, he'd got knocked down in that fight, and he never went through that final eliminator with Alexander Povetkin because obviously it was called off. So there were some shady circumstances with that one, and obviously the Brazil one was similarly murky, and it wasn't confirmed publicly for 6 months or so. But Brazil as well, he's been sort of sitting on the pine, on the bench, waiting and waiting and waiting. So effectively, because he was saying for several months before it was confirmed, I'm your mandatory, Wilder, come on, face me, come on, face me. So we're talking early 2018, and now this fight is only being confirmed in March 2019, and he was waiting for well over, it's basically the best part of 18 months now. And he wouldn't have even got the shot against Deontay Wilder had it not been for Tyson Fury pulling out. So the way that they were going to resolve that situation was create that interim title for Whyte and Brazil to fight for. And that is different to the mandatory status, but that is the way they were going to resolve his mandatory position within the WBC, giving him an interim title, a version of a heavyweight title to fight for against Whyte. Obviously, that collapses in a heap. Whyte is left sort of without a chair and obviously looking around going, well, I was just meant to have this fight. What is happening now? What are you going to do? I should be the mandatory. And certainly there was a strong case for the body of work that Dillian Whyte has built up with the wins that he's had at WBC, ranked fighters that he's beaten, that he probably could have been the WBC mandatory, but because of this other situation where Brazil was able to exert some pressure through his management because of what had happened to him, with Stavern being elevated to fight Wilder back in November 2017, they made a case and said, look, you owe this to us. We beat Molina in that eliminator, which was a final eliminator. We deserve the mandatory shot. And he got it. So now that there is the similar circumstance, you would think Whyte would be in with a good shout of being made mandatory, but even then, he may have to wait some considerable time. And given the WBC writes the rules as it goes along, because that's exactly what happens. They have loopholes galore that, you could drive a bus through. There is no guaranteeing that he will fight Deontay Wilder anytime soon if he was made the mandatory. And that's, on the proviso that Deontay Wilder holds the belt and he continues to hold it. So who knows what will happen, because he will face Dominic Brazil, his actual mandatory, and he will likely have a couple of voluntaries, if that is, of course, if an Anthony Joshua fight doesn't get made. So you can kind of imagine the order would probably be a Luis Ortiz rematch, an Adam Kovnatsky fight, and then just maybe after that, the WBC would call the mandatory fight, and that could be midway through or the back end of 2020. So Dillian Whyte might end up winning some sort of small victory with the WBC, but it might end up feeling a bit hollow. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.